If the 60s were the time of Auntie's liberation, then the 70s were to be the golden age of BBC television.
And now for something completely different.
The experiments of the last decade had matured into a whole new range of programmes: light entertainment, drama, current affairs, sport and documentary series. But the structure of the corporation was to prove less secure than the strength of its programme making suggested.
I suppose immediately I think of the BBC, I would smile. I would be very grateful for the opportunities it gave me as an actor.
If you so much as sniggers, I'm going straight back indoors.
The number of viewers for BBC comedy programmes like The Good Life and To the Manor Born broke all records.
Grateful.
I remember when the figures came out, it was something like 28 million, and people phoned me up and said, "It's amazing, isn't it amazing?" And I said, yes, I can't conceive of what that means. And I was doing something at Broadcasting House that day, and I walked up Regent Street and I was thinking about this, and I thought, I suppose what it means that every other person in the land at that time must have sat down and watched it. And so I walked up Regent Street thinking, gosh, every other person. No one looked at me and smiled at all.
The BBC had 12 working orchestras, and many of its programmes sold throughout the world.
That's the sun wind! We'll make no headway against the sou'easter, sir.
It was a fantastic atmosphere at the BBC because there were so many good programmes being made. And it was so exciting to be involved in them, and just even walking around the corridors and going up to the canteen, and there'd be, 100 people dressed for when the boat comes in.
Till the boat comes in, dance to the daddy, sing to the mummy, dance to...
Go to the devil! This is an outrage that I will not put up with.
There were new art shows, highbrow series, and popular hits.
Until then, it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
BBC Current Affairs made renewed efforts to reach out to people throughout the regions of Britain.
It was the nation talking to the nation. People were always on your side. That's what people liked about Nationwide. You were their friends. The kind of celebrity we've always had, people who began on Nationwide, has been a very friendly celebrity because people knew you. So they allowed things to go wrong. Your editor hated it. The audience loved it.
You will not.
And on location with Nationwide, things did go wrong.
We haven't got it. We can't do it in a rubber dinghy. It's ridiculous.
That's Life brought together a new mix of consumerism and occasionally vulgar light entertainment.
It was an odd mixture of jokes, investigative journalism, and had to reflect viewers' weekly lives, the laughter and the matters of concern. It broke all the broadcasting rules. At the time, I don't think it could have been done by ITV, who are dependent on advertisers.
It seems that highly trained salesmen can use very clever sales talk to persuade people to part with hundreds of pounds for something they may not need, may not even want.
And we were criticising the biggest advertisers, the car manufacturers, gas, electricity, even the government. It was very much part of the BBC of its time.
Who's this then? Start you, my...
From BBC Comedy came the popular and politically incorrect Fawlty Towers.
I'm trying to cheer her up, you stupid kraut!
Auntie, conscious of her stuffy image in the past, attempted to connect with Britain's youth. up to 12 million people tuned into Top of the Pops.
Let me take you by the hand and lead you through the streets of London. I'll show you something to make the change you...
But if the 70s were the golden age for BBC television viewers, they were also a period of strife and industrial unrest in Britain.
As Prime Minister, I want to speak to you simply and plainly about the grave emergency now facing our country. We are asking you to cut down to the absolute minimum the use of electricity for heating and for other purposes in your homes.
Throughout the 70s, the BBC brought news into British homes of strikes in the mining industry, among power and transport workers, and in professions where no one had ever been on strike before.
I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos.
Things came to a head late in 1978 with the winter of discontent. Times were tough for the general public, but the lights were blazing at the television centre. Colour licences had boosted the BBC's income, but with inflation, Auntie was living beyond her means. Her premises, staff, self-esteem, and also her debts were all on the increase. And once again, the BBC had begun to antagonise the political establishment.
Mr. Day, you've been an interviewer for a long time, and you knew before you even phrased the question that you wouldn't get me to comment on that particular matter. Why not turn to a more profitable line?
Because it's a matter of great interest
well,
to a lot of people here.
in that case, you'd better discuss it with Mr. Jenkins, but you're not going to get me to make statements that you'll then throw at Mr. Jenkins and try to set us at each other's ears. I'm not going to take part in that game to satisfy a television panel.
BBC journalists believed it was their job to find out from politicians why Britain was in such a state.
The idea grew up in the 70s that it wasn't so much the BBC was anti-left or anti-right, it was that the BBC was being cynical about the whole democratic process, and that the BBC was even regarding itself, as it were, as certainly as a parallel to Parliament in its significance. And this was a very, very dangerous position for the BBC to have got into.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister.
In 1979, Britain had a new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher.
Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher.
The Conservative leader had a new agenda for the country.
Just ask Mr. the BBC, Mrs. Thatcher. It's been a wonderful campaign for you. Congratulations.
Mrs. Thatcher based her political ideology on the belief that if Britain was to be rescued from decline, it should relinquish state control of its industries and introduce private finance into the economy. The BBC was to be no exception.
I mean, it was always said that she couldn't pass an institution by without handbagging it. I think that her main concerns then were the method of financing. She regarded the licence fee as a sort of enforced taxation, supported by criminal sanctions. And that worried her. Secondly, why not advertising at least on some programmes? She had to ask that question. Thirdly, I think that there was a query about the values of the BBC, especially in relation to what I regard as the tendency for at least certain kinds of television producer to shove or try to push the frontiers of decency as far back as they can. I think she was obviously worried about that.
In March 1979, Mrs. Thatcher's political friend and ally, Auntie Neve, had been murdered by an Irish terrorist bomb at the House of Commons. 6 months later, Panorama decided to make a film on Irish republicanism.
The Auntie Neve assassination was a terrible event. I think its main impact, and the main impact I underestimated, was the impact on Mrs. Thatcher and members of the government. But in some ways that made it more urgent to look at the situation in Northern Ireland. Why did they want to kill Auntie Neve? Who were the people who would do such things? And let's look at the whole of the Republican movement.
Panorama producer David Darlow received a tip-off that he should travel to the Northern Irish village of Carrickmore with his crew. they were greeted by an IRA roadblock.
The sun was glaring on the windscreen. It's very difficult to see anything. But then, out of the dazzle, we saw the silhouette of a person with a gun, and then another, and then another. And we didn't know quite what we were getting ourselves into.
But as the Panorama team continued to film, it became clear that the incident was a stunt. It appeared the IRA was staging the roadblock for the benefit of the BBC cameras.
What was going on there was a nonsense. They were examining the underside of cars as if for suspect bombs, this in a staunchly Republican village. And there was no atmosphere of threat or fear at all. Children were cycling around there quite happily. And there was a nudge, nudge, wink, wink atmosphere about the whole thing. And we were angry. We were angry that the IRA should think that we would be impressed with such a cheap publicity stunt.
The British press got to hear that the BBC had been filming the IRA in Northern Ireland.
I was preparing my press digester and I came across a relatively small piece in the Financial Times which said that the BBC had been filming IRA terrorists holding up the traffic, taking control, in effect, of the village of Carrickmore. Well, I exploded on the spot. I said, that is not the function of the media.
No decision had yet been made by Panorama's editor as to whether or not this filmed material should be transmitted.
What matters in all these occasions is what's transmitted, not what information you gather. If you're a journalist, a print journalist, you go, you look, you write something down with your pencil in shorthand. Whether you write the article is what matters and whether the article is published. I didn't even have an opportunity to decide whether I wanted to publish the pictures.
None of the Carrickmore film was broadcast, but the press accused the BBC of collaborating with the IRA.
A member of the government rang up and said, hey, what were these people doing in Carrickmore? And nobody in the BBC knew they'd been there or that they had been hobnobbing with the IRA. And it went on and got more and more complicated, the row.
There was clearly panic in the organisation. Mrs. Thatcher was on the warpath. There had to be, a head had to roll. And the victim selected was Roger Bolton.
Bolton was accused of not properly referring the matter upward within the BBC and was suspended.
The way in which the journalism operated was that you didn't ask permission to do everything. You were given a programme, you knew the principles by which you had to behave, and you referred upwards when you thought it appropriate. In other words, you didn't go and say, please sir, can we go to Northern Ireland? You decided whether it was proper for you to do it, you went, and then you told people.
The very fact that the BBC had filmed Irish terrorists was enough to condemn it in the eyes of the government.
The IRA is not merely in the business of murdering people, it's in the business of publicity. And publicity which demonstrates that it has the power to disrupt the life of a nation. And I think that Mrs. Thatcher was anxious that the media should not give them the oxygen of publicity that they clearly desired to get.
Plans for the programme were abandoned. After an internal investigation, Bolton was reinstated as editor of Panorama. He is now an independent producer.
Once you give in to government on these issues, you've had it. The BBC is either independent or it isn't. And it must not make speeches about its independence, and it must not tell other countries that it is an independent organisation if, in the end, under pressure of government, it is going to say, actually, this is a no-go area. I mean, that's just totally hypocritical. Why bother have a BBC in that case?
Despite the political confrontations, the BBC continued to provide programmes the public and even Mrs. Thatcher wanted to see.
Well, the very first episode of Yes, Minister was done actually in this studio. The gallery looked a little different then, but I was allocated to Vision Mix. I didn't know what to expect.
I believe you know each other.
Yes, we did cross swords when the Minister gave me a grilling over the estimates in the Public Accounts Committee last
I wouldn't
year.
say that.
Well, you came up with all the questions I hoped nobody would ask.
Well, opposition's about asking awkward questions.
And government is about not answering them.
Well, you answer all mine anyway.
I'm glad you thought so, Minister.
There is an absolutely wonderful speech that up to the last time that I met Nigel Hawthorne, who played Sir Humphrey, could still say after all this time.
Well, briefly, sir, I am the Permanent Under-Secretary of State, known as the Permanent Secretary. Woolley here's your Principal Private Secretary. I, too, have a Principal Private Secretary, and he is the Principal Private Secretary to the Permanent Secretary. Directly responsible to me are 10 Deputy Secretaries, 87 Under-Secretaries, and 219 Assistant Secretaries. Directly responsible to the Principal Private Secretaries are plain Private Secretaries, and the Prime Minister will be appointing 2 Parliamentary Under-Secretaries, and you will be appointing your own Parliamentary Private Secretary.
We realised just how funny this was going to be. And the cameramen were actually laughing, which is something in itself.
Can they all type?
None of us can type, Minister. Mrs. Mackay types. She's the Secretary.
Do I understand correctly that no one at the circus knows you're in England?
Only Mr. Gwilym.
You're officially absent without leave.
I've got a story to tell you. It's all about spies.
There were ever more successes on both television and radio, which, as the BBC never missed an opportunity of pointing out, cost the viewers only £1 a week.
You might have noticed in the deep blue seas of the earth a few mysterious, beautiful shapes in turquoise, and guessed that life on Earth had really started.
Gives a job. Go on. Gives it. Go ahead.
A job?
Yeah, gives it. Go on. I know you've got one. Arthur told me. Go on, gives it.
Now? Today?
You're listening to Today on Radio 4 with John Timpson and Brian Redhead. Trade unions...
Mrs. Thatcher was said never to miss the Today programme on Radio 4.
...to contravene laws to which they object.
And now the shipping forecast. The general synopsis at 1800...
And the shipping forecast was a lifeline to seafarers, but baffled many every day.
Viking, north and south Utsira, 40s. Southwesterly, veering northwesterly...
In popular television, Auntie was more than holding her own against ITV, thanks to Bill Cotton's Saturday night schedule for BBC One, which took off with the Generation Game.
I went to Holland and I saw a game called 1 out of 8, done by Vara Television. And I thought, as I looked at it, that is going to be a perfect vehicle for Bruce Forsyth.
Game, nice to see you,
And then, of course, there was the popular drama spot, which probably the most successful of which was All Creatures Great and Small. And then, of course, we had Eric and Ernie. They were undoubtedly the jewel in the crown of the BBC as far as variety programmes were concerned. They rehearsed, and they rehearsed, and then they rehearsed some more. And everything you see, everything that looks as though it's spontaneous, is very heavily rehearsed spontaneity. And then, of course, there was Match of the Day, when Mum went up and washed her hair, and the old man and whoever was allowed to sit up with him watch the football.
The programmes had never been better, and in 1981, the government renewed the BBC's charter for a further 15 years. But the expense of programmes, a staff of close to 30,000, and the demands of the broadcasting unions meant that by 1982 the BBC's costs were running out of control. Within the year, its borrowing would escalate to more than £15 million. And the BBC was about to be engulfed in a crisis which would further test both its resources and its relations with the government. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentina invaded the British territories in the Falklands. 3 days later, the Royal Navy Task Force set sail on the long journey to recapture the islands. But it would take 3 weeks until there was any real action. And during this time, BBC's Panorama mounted a programme entitled Can We Avoid War?
We made a programme on Panorama which looked at whether there was the possibility of a diplomatic solution, and also talked to a number of MPs, Conservative MPs, who had doubts about what they saw as Mrs. Thatcher's gung-ho attitude. Now, these MPs had scarcely been given a voice, but Mrs. Thatcher, when it went out, hit the roof.
Conservative MP Sally Oppenheim described the programme as an odious and subversive travesty. BBC chairman George Howard was summoned to Westminster to explain himself to the Tory party. With him was Acting Director General Alistair Milne.
George and I went down to the Commons, and they shouted and roared at us for an hour that we had allowed dissident voices to speak when the nation's soldiers were risking their lives in the task force on their way to the Falklands. This would not be allowable in any civilized country, and clearly showed that the BBC was a left-wing organisation bent on defeating the government.
The remoteness of the Falklands meant a delay in sending back television pictures to a public hungry for news. Instead, war artists gave their impressions of the fighting.
We were reduced in Britain to quick sketch artists of a sort who had previously been seen in the Illustrated London News in the 1890s. The Falklands gave the military an absolutely ideal example of a position in which they controlled everything. They had the only uplinks to the satellites, they had the only way of getting stuff back through the fleet, back to Ascension Island, back to England. They could dictate everything that was going on with the mass media, and they did so.
The bulk of the island, black against a luminous sky, was suddenly lit up by star shells and red tracer lines which climbed lazily up towards...
Aware that film of men in combat might shock the public, as it had America during the Vietnam War, the Ministry of Defence delayed satellite transmission of television images. Once again, the interests of the government and the broadcasters were diametrically opposed.
Messages came back from the Crimean War in 21 days. Some of them came back from the Falklands in 23 days. You know, it took that long to get the stuff back to the UK. And there were rows in the Falklands between the MOD people there and the MOD people back here, double security, double checks. The World Service, of course, were broadcasting all the time.
With the shortage of pictures, the Falklands conflict, like World War II, was played out through eyewitness radio reports.
Hello, this is Mary White back with you again with a special edition of Calling the Falklands.
I embarked with a parachute battalion in 4 landing craft, exactly the D-Day model. The force approached a sheltered inlet with a hamlet of a few houses and a jetty. Only a few dogs barked. It appeared that surprise was complete.
Robert Fox was a BBC radio correspondent in the Falklands. He spent much of the campaign up front, close to the action, often alongside Commanding Officer Major General Julian Thompson.
I'm in the water. And I'm on the beach now. A British parachute force is back on the Falklands.
As a radio reporter, you are the verbal camera, and the verbal image that the radio reporter can project is still, I think, the single most dramatic piece of rational war reporting available to modern media.
Average radio listening increased by 45 minutes a week. But there was one radio report which damaged the BBC's reputation. On the 27th of May 1982, the World Service announced the paratroop attack on Goose Green before it began.
I didn't hear the broadcast, but I was told about it, and I was first absolutely furious, and then I thought, my God, we've lost surprise. They'd been told what we're going to do. Who could have given away this information? And I then thought, well, maybe I better cancel the operation. And eventually I decided to go ahead with it.
17 paratroopers died in the battle, but the source of the news report, which may have endangered British lives, was never revealed.
As some people have said, it came from the Ministry of Defence. My hunch is that it did come from someone in the Ministry of Defence. Whether it was as specific as it became, I'm doubtful about, because I don't believe anybody would have been that stupid. And I think it was wrong to broadcast something of that kind without being quite specific and checking very carefully.
We checked it out thoroughly. And in fact, the MOD gave us a story and agreed it to be transmitted before we put it out. It's their fault, not ours. Yep.
No more opening fire. No more opening fire. No more.
When the surrender came, BBC Radio was the first to bring the news to the world.
I didn't know what the state of the negotiations was, and as usual, one of my operators switched his HF set over to listen to the World Service, and I was standing, I can remember standing in this darkened house with no electricity, on the landing, and I suddenly heard these words, that they had surrendered. And I was hearing from the BBC 8,000 miles away about an event that was happening only 800 yards from where I was standing, and it was an exceedingly emotional moment.
Mrs. Thatcher was returned to office the following year with an increased majority. She could now embark on the radical reform of the major British institutions: the Health Service, British Airways, British Steel, and the Civil Service.
Don't forget that Margaret Thatcher privatised getting on for 50 industries and services in this country, and therefore it was part of her very being to question whether indeed it was right that the state should run industries and services.
The BBC was not at the top of the Prime Minister's agenda, nor was it, strictly speaking, a state-run industry. But there were signs she had the corporation in her sights. The Board of Governors, appointed to represent the viewing public, was by tradition politically neutral. Under Mrs. Thatcher, this changed.
The governors, for the first time, have been packed by Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet. Traditionally, the governors are a neutral body. They're not picked for being politically or in any other way representative. I can remember an Edinburgh Television Festival occasion during this time when the governors were referred to throughout the festival as Maggie's placemen. And it would be difficult to deny that some of them were certainly seen in that light.
Stuart Young, appointed to the board in 1981, a successful accountant whose brother was to become a cabinet minister in the Thatcher government. Daphne Park, board member, former senior MI6 officer and principal of Somerville, Mrs. Thatcher's old Oxford College. Malcolm McAlpine, new board member, cousin of Tory party treasurer Alistair McAlpine. And the new vice chairman, William Rees-Mogg, former editor of The Times and one-time Conservative parliamentary candidate.
I thought when I came in that the BBC was an organisation ripe for change. The institution had closed in on itself and needed to open up. There was a tremendous reluctance to admit error. There was inefficiency in terms of how many people were employed, how money was spent, and so on, which was not anything like as tight as it should have been. There was total difficulty in finding out where responsibility lay for almost anything.
Rees-Mogg remained vice chairman in 1983 after Stuart Young was made chairman. The tradition of the two senior governors coming from different ends of the political spectrum had been broken. When Alistair Milne was made Director General in 1982, Mrs. Thatcher asked, "Is he one of us?" Milne soon had problems with the Board of Governors.
He used to say to me, "What am I going to do about the governors?" And my answer was always the same to him. I'd say, "Alistair, you must be more clever. You are the professionals, you are the people who know the job. You know what the facts are, you know what the arguments are. You've got this enormous, brilliant body of people behind you. Show them how brilliant you are. Because if you don't tell them, they won't know."
But at that time, the BBC was being criticised for falling standards. When it broadcast a popular series, The Thornbirds, displacing Panorama and shown against ITV's The Jewel in the Crown, the BBC was attacked by the Evening Standard for showing one of the most paltry, tawdry, imported soap operas that any TV channel has ever had the contempt to inflict on the viewing public.
I know I didn't like it. I can't remember exactly what I said. I know I was not enthusiastic, though I was opposed to the way it was being attacked by the government. But I called it, well, my words were quasi-pornographic trash, I'm afraid.
I'm getting in between them.
The BBC came in for more criticism over its coverage of the 1984 miners' strike.
He's kicking me! Kick him! He's kicking me! Kick him in the mouth!
Basically, the miners looked at on the BBC as we were in the hands of the government. We were, part of Maggie's propaganda machine, I think. I found it actually applied to both sides because, the police were very suspicious of us as well. It was quite an effort to get through. That's really what we were after, was just to get to the truth. There was just a lot of anger. As a cameraman in the middle of all this, trying to get somewhere near the truth, what inevitably happened was that you finished up angering both sides.
It seemed as if the BBC was pleasing no one. ITV and Channel 4, the new competitor to BBC Two, were together attracting 60% of the audience share. But BBC One had a secret weapon up its sleeve.
We commissioned the best writers, and I just said very simply, let's make it the best produced, best written, best directed, best performed, twice-weekly drama that there has ever been, and let's make it even better than Coronation Street.
Look, I don't have a barney with you, Doc, but he's being charged with something, so even you can't pass him off as Snow White.
Well, all youngsters get up to wild things as part of growing up, isn't it? But he's not a bad lad, not deep down.
Well, I'll just have to take your word for that, won't I? But what I said earlier still stands. If he gets off and comes back to Wolford, I don't want him showing his face in the Vic.
Oh, you're hypocrites round here, the lot of you! Hypocrites!
Nobody realised how successful it was going to be, but they built this massive set, which was like a real street and a real square. And all the artists on, of course, were all unknowns, really. Or Wendy Richards was one that she was known, but a lot of them were fairly unknown.
Look, Mum, why can't you just accept what's happened and be glad for us, eh? You know, you really upset Arthur today. He can't take that sort of aggro.
Cab drivers are the best barometers ever for letting you know if you're any good or not. And when EastEnders first started, see, I don't drive, so I'm a great black cab merchant. I used to get real ear bashings off of some of the drivers, and my old mum, she's just like that Lou Beale and all that sort of thing, But then if there was something they didn't think was right, they would tell you that too, in no uncertain terms.
EastEnders became the cult soap of the mid-80s, outstripping its rival Coronation Street. The television licence was once again under negotiation. Mrs. Thatcher was fundamentally opposed to a levy on the public at large as a means of paying for the BBC. But the BBC fought back.
Apart from excellent drama, the natural history programmes, the sports coverage, news, current affairs, documentaries, the consumer programmes, series, films, Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4, children's television, science, comedy, alternative comedy and music. What have the BBC ever given us?
Well, there's chat shows.
Oh, shut up, Wogan. I mean, there's not even any commercials. Well, except this one.
We ran a very strong campaign about the licence fee increase. On television, we did a lot of interviews in the press, and didn't do very well. The press were not sympathetic. The press actually were extremely hostile. Times, after all, wrote 3 leaders for the first time in its history since the abdication of 1936, arguing that we had to take advertising.
Mrs. Thatcher was absolutely determined to really, I think, try to privatise the BBC to a degree of getting some advertising on.
She had single-mindedly decided that the one way to avoid putting the licence fee up to what she thought were impossible levels was for us to take part advertising, part licence fee.
But the Peacock inquiry into how the BBC should be financed did not do what Mrs. Thatcher wanted. It rejected advertising and recommended the continuation of the licence fee, contrary to the views of many Tory MPs.
My experience of this often repeated claim that the public don't like paying the licence fee, made by politicians, who quite frequently say, my mailbag is full of letters from people who don't like paying the licence fee, and pretending that there are a lot of people out there who only watch ITV, who never watch the BBC, and therefore shouldn't have to pay for it. My experience is that that is an absolute fiction, which goes along with a political attitude, which believes you shouldn't have to pay a licence fee. And so they pretend that the public hates it.
The Prime Minister retaliated by pegging the licence fee to the rate of inflation.
This my problem here.
Denied a real increase, the BBC went further into the red. Despite its programme successes, to many in the government, the BBC continued to represent a comfortable bureaucracy with an expanding unionised staff, living beyond its means at the expense of the public.
They saw the BBC as being, annoyingly for them, a highly successful example of something which on the whole the British liked, as they liked the National Health Service, and got on with, and which was highly successful, but which ideologically speaking they completely hated, because it represented the very things that Thatcherism didn't believe in. So it was inevitable there would be a huge explosion, and there was.
The explosion came once again over Northern Ireland. As part of its Real Lives series, the BBC produced a documentary called At the Edge of the Union, which looked at the two forms of extremism in Irish politics, nationalism and loyalism.
Republic of People of Tyrone. I am proud.
The film featured Sinn Féin leader Martin McGuinness, an elected councillor but generally believed to be a leading IRA member, and loyalist leader Gregory Campbell.
In a Fleet Street newspaper, as the Chief of Staff of the IRA.
As transmission approached, Director General Alistair Milne left for a holiday abroad. The Real Lives film had been referred upward within the BBC, but Milne, ultimately responsible as editor-in-chief, was not aware of its controversial nature. The style of the film was not to confront its subjects, but to give them space to explain. The viewers would make up their own minds on the merits of what they heard. To some, this style of filmmaking would portray McGuinness in an unexpected light.
The fly-on-the-wall technique, which the whole of this series of Real Lives was using, meant that no questions were put to anybody. They were just allowed to talk. They were filmed in their family in very sympathetic circumstances, and they put their own case in their own words, with no questions being put to them to test that case.
How do you and you now, or Emmett's going to eat this all up?
So I thought it just made the terrorist look a rather nice guy. You saw him with his family. And any man with his children on his knee looks a rather pleasant human being, or at least most people do. And he certainly did. I thought it concealed the real nature of the man, which is to kill people.
When the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, heard about the film, he asked the BBC not to broadcast it.
I thought that it was not desirable that the BBC should give currency to people who openly advocated the use of murder and maiming as a political weapon and were involved in that.
With Milne abroad, the governors viewed the programme, and although they had no formal editorial responsibility, decided not to broadcast it. Milne returned from holiday and insisted it go out. Journalists went on strike to defend the BBC's independence.
I had said it's going to be transmitted, and we're going to get this sorted out. This programme's going out, because I've seen it. There's nothing wrong with it, apart from minor adjustments. Which is a very difficult position to find yourself in. And my colleagues at the Television Centre, I spoke to some of them, and they were not impressed by my position. I wasn't impressed by my position either.
The Director General made it public that he disagreed with the governors.
In a moment of anger, I said that these people are a bunch of amateurs. Yes, And I regret that a bit. But the plain fact of life is that, I had to negotiate myself out of it, and they had to concede. They were wrong. I know they were wrong.
The BBC governors did not take kindly to being publicly crossed. Chairman Stuart Young cornered Milne before the Director General was due to appear on breakfast television.
Well, I said, I don't know how all the press could have got it wrong, because I gather it's all the papers, but I'll be watching the breakfast television, and if you say that programme is going to be broadcast, that is a downright lie. I will meet you at Broadcasting House at 11 o'clock in the morning, and if by 11 o'clock you haven't resolved this matter and got the true story to the press, I will not accept your resignation at 11. I will fire you at 11. He wasn't terribly happy.
Tempers were running very high, and I was, after all, as the chief executive of the BBC, in a position where the board had not only overruled, in my absence, the Board of Management, but actually in my presence had refuted all the propositions I'd put to them and ignored them.
Were you surprised, for example?
Interviewed on Breakfast TV, Milne appeared to compromise. He stated the film would not go out immediately, but with changes could be shown in the future.
Well, let's get it right. I never thought I'd lost my editorial control. What the governors said, which is absolutely truthful, is that they constitutionally are the BBC, and if they choose to take a view about a programme, that is absolutely their right. The fact that we didn't agree about it is extremely unfortunate, and therefore there's been a lot of discussion since. All I'm saying is that, in my judgment, with changes, it will go out in due course.
The programme eventually went out 2 months later. But the row had caused a complete breakdown in relations between the governors and the Director General. Privately, Milne felt his authority had been totally undermined. The press had already decided the BBC was out of control. The Monocle Mutineer, a series about a World War I mutiny, was mistakenly publicised by the BBC as a true story, and then was exposed by the press as being only loosely based on the facts.
It was one of many programmes which raised the issue of faction, and this habit which has grown of dramatists getting mixed up with current affairs producers and taking some event from the past and turning it into a drama, with all sorts of caveats that this doesn't purport to be a historical account, but nonetheless comes across as a historical account. And it's not fact, it is fiction mingled with fact in a way which makes it very difficult for people to distinguish between the two.
Within sight of our seafront hotel, a series of flashes and a low rumbling indicated that the intended targets were well within the city.
When the Americans bombed Libya in April 1986, the BBC was accused by Norman Tebbit of broadcasting speculation, error and Libyan propaganda for showing the damage to residential areas. This was particularly sensitive, as the US Air Force had used British bases from which to mount the raid.
4 hours after the raid, the Libyans still have no idea how many people were injured here. This is at least 2 miles from the barracks. There are still people possibly buried under this rubble.
Examination of the targeting had shown that the American pilots had misinterpreted photographic reconnaissance. In a city which is full of bland-looking, similar flyovers, roundabouts, in that sort of rent-an-architect sort of planning applied to developing cities sometimes, it had all looked the same. And they'd got the wrong targeting points.
At the Central Hospital, the senior doctor estimated that between 60 and 100 casualties had been brought in, and 2 other hospitals have also been taking in casualties.
ITN's treatment was not favourable to the Libyan cause. I think still that the coverage which was given by the BBC was, shall I say, of encouragement to many people in Libya.
At least this hospital had been on full alert last night, with all of its staff standing by. Some of the people brought
I wouldn't retract a single word. Why should I? They were factual. So one realised that we were in for a rocky time, because it was not what it purported to be, which was just complaint about factual errors. It was, in fact, part of a political barrage.
As Director General, Alistair Milne carried the can for what a hostile government saw as BBC bias and incompetent management.
He was the worst possible person, or one of the worst possible types of people, to have to deal with the Thatcher government. They were poles apart. They were utterly different.
Milne's style of leadership was out of step with Tory values. Secretly, the governors were planning to act against him.
In retrospect, obviously, they decided that they'd had me, I think.
The board's confidence in him was diminished, and I think that of the senior staff. I think they felt disappointed by his discharge of that particular office after a marvellous career before that. And after I'd left, of course, the parting of the ways came.
Before the final act was played out, the BBC was to have a change at the very top.
The government has announced that the new chairman of the BBC is to be Duke Hussey, former managing director of Times newspapers. He succeeds Stuart Young, who died at the end of August.
I think it was obvious to everybody in the media and to a great many people outside the media, the BBC was going through a very difficult phase. There had been a lot of mistakes. There was a great deal of hostility to the BBC at all levels. My main aspiration when I joined the BBC was I wanted to restore it to the position in public esteem that it enjoyed about 15 years ago. I felt it had slipped.
The chairman is appointed by the Prime Minister, and Tory MPs this afternoon urged him to tackle what they called the left-wing mafia at the BBC.
One of the first acts of the new chairman and his deputy, Lord Barnett, was to call for the papers on an impending libel action against the corporation. 4 Conservative MPs had been accused of links with neo-fascist groups in a programme broadcast by Panorama 2 years earlier, Maggie's Militant Tendency.
Good evening. Tonight we have a major investigation into extreme right-wing links with the Conservative Party. Extreme right-wing links that go so far as a number of MPs.
It was designed as a hatchet job, not merely against particular individuals, but to imply that there was an element of extremism in the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher, an extremism which was unsavoury in its political connections, and an extremism which influenced Margaret Thatcher herself. And it seemed to me that it was based on pretty thin evidence.
2 of the MPs featured, Neil Hamilton and Gerald Howarth, took the lead in suing the BBC. 2 years after transmission, the case was about to come to court.
Here was a fully researched programme where we had thousands of pages of evidence, where we had hundreds of witnesses, despite the attempts to lean on some of our witnesses and to get them to change their stories in kind of rather frightening Stalinist ways that took place. But they stood firm. And the BBC had always said that it was going to defend this case.
I thought we got it right, so I said so. I said it was rock solid.
I had the good fortune one day to receive in a plain brown envelope, of course, some information about the legal advice which had been given to the corporation over its chances of winning the action. Broadly speaking, they were that on a fine day, with the following wind, the right judge, and a good deal of luck, there was a sporting chance that the BBC might win the action. I also discovered that that had been reported to the governors of the BBC as a legal opinion which had said they had a good chance of winning the action. I think I may have played some part in bringing about a settlement by making sure that the governors were aware of the nature of the legal advice which had been given.
Hussey sought advice directly from the BBC's lawyers. Believing they might lose the case, the governors pulled the rug from under the Director General's feet.
The governors more or less instructed me to pull out. And I made the point that counsel had said he must have the chance to cross-examine Hamilton and Howarth. They said no, so we had to pull out, and we were taken for 25,000 damages each and $250,000 costs. This was another huge thing in the press. It caused my resignation, 100 MPs put down a motion. So we had that. There were troubles circulating in the system, but mainly around my head.
And we can judge those who ought properly to be kicked out of the BBC in the same way as the Panorama programme said that we should be kicked out of the Conservative Party and kicked out of Parliament.
By now, the governors had decided that Milne had to go. The board was consulted in advance, and the decision was unanimous.
The secretary of the BBC, Patricia Hodgson, said to me, Alistair, the chairman would like to see you. She'd never called me by my Christian name before, oddly enough. So I said, where is he? And he was in his office. So I went in, and there were he and Barnett. And the sun was shining, and I remember. And his lip was trembling as he said, this is going to be a very difficult interview. And I said, and he said, we want you to leave immediately. And I looked at him thinking, what is he talking about? And he said, it's a unanimous decision of the board. And I said nothing. And Barnett said, and then he said, you might like to resign for personal reasons. And Barnett said, we are men of honor. It'll make no difference to your arrangements. And I said nothing again. And then I thought, they're mad.
Very short interview. The Director General played with great dignity. We informed him that it was a unanimous view of the governors that an immediate change was necessary in the position of Director General. But we thought that in the interest of the BBC and his own interest, a letter of resignation, which I would require immediately, was the most dignified way of dealing with the matter.
He came in and said, they've sacked me. In actual fact, I've resigned and I'm going home. And he turned round and walked out with his bag.
The governors had asserted their authority and forced out the Director General.
It is significant that after I left, Hussey said to a former colleague of mine, who asked him why I went the way I did, Hussey said, he represented producer power and he had to go. I regard myself, rightly or wrongly, as the last true Director General of the BBC.
Most Conservatives were rather pleased that Alistair Milne had gone. I think we felt that he was part of that BBC establishment view, which saw the centre, particularly in political life and perhaps in social life in many ways, rather on one side from where we thought it was.
I'm Marmaduke Hussey, chairman of the BBC, and this is the Crystal Palace transmitting station. Rather like me, it's probably a bit you haven't seen very often. But it's a very
Hussey was to adopt his own agenda, to rescue the BBC from what he saw as the mess it was in, and to make it face up to the future.
I went round the BBC saying, look, I know nothing about broadcasting, but it seems to me pretty certain that in 5 or 6 years' time there'll be 8 or 10 alternative television channels, and God knows how many radio. What are our plans for that? There weren't any. And when I remonstrated, I said, well, and a very, very senior member of the BBC said, oh, it won't happen, Chairman, it won't happen. And I said, well, you know much more than I do, I'm sure you're right, but just supposing you're wrong, wouldn't it be a good idea to have sort of plan B tucked away in a drawer? There was no plan B. Well, there is now. I believe that the multiplicity of channels, all funded from advertising, will lead inevitably to deterioration in standards. And since I said that publicly, an awful lot of other people have come out and said it too. Well, the BBC is not going to chase them down into the gutter. We're going to keep our standards high.
2 men were entrusted with the task of shaping the BBC for the future. Michael Checkland, an accountant who had spent most of his BBC career in resources, was appointed Director General. Brought in from London Weekend Television as Checkland's deputy, with special responsibility for news and current affairs, was John Burt. The traditions of the BBC had survived since 1922. The question now was whether its standards and values could adapt to the changes planned by the new management and how it would meet the challenges of the next decade.
I've been part of something which I had listened to as a child and thought wonderful. I've found that through most of my time with it, it hasn't disappointed me or let me down. There's still in the corridors of the BBC, there are people you find working on programmes and you find taking time, concerned, involved, and not for ego, not for glory, certainly not for money. All the traditional values that I first met in the BBC, the core still survives, just.
I think the BBC is a marvellous corporation. It's peculiar, isn't it? It's eccentric in many ways. It was created nearly 75 years ago, a public organisation, to serve the people, educate, inform, entertain, all these rather worthy things. You would think at this end of the 20th century that it had done its time, that it would be out of date, and yet, it all still shines through with astonishing clarity, the value of it.